Welcome everyone to our final web series, our final web seminar tonight. We're going to be joined this evening by Dr. Beniko Mason and Dr. Stephen Krashen. And this evening, we're going to just be moderating the chat box. If you have any questions, we won't be having a Q&A this evening, but we will try to answer your questions if you want to join in the chat box. So the talks tonight are Dr. Mason is going to give a summary of story listening, what we've heard over the last 4 web seminars. And then Dr. Krashen will come up to talk about advancing the theory, I think playing the guessing game or playing the believing game. And so thank you all for joining in tonight. We're going to try to end tonight with an open ending of where you can find the people that presented and where you can find additional papers and websites that can help get you started with story listening, guided self-selected reading in your classroom. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Beniko Mason, who's going to provide us a summary of what we've heard in the last 4 web seminars.
Okay. Hello everybody. Am I showing on the screen? Okay. Hi, today I would like to talk about what story listening is, and I'd like to show you the PowerPoint that I have prepared, and I will talk along with the PowerPoint. And so this is the one. And how do I do this? This one. Yep. Okay. So story listening. Today, July 3rd, 2020. It's me, Beniko Mason. Okay, everybody. So what is story listening? Story listening is the story listening focus is on understanding and enjoying the story. The teacher makes the story more comprehensible by selecting words from the story that she thinks the students may not know. She makes the meanings of these words clear as she tells the story using what we call comprehension aiding supplementation, which are like drawing a picture, paraphrase, brief translation, and providing helpful linguistic context. The teacher's goal is to make incomprehensible items in the story comprehensible and also to add interesting detail. A little more about what story listening is. There is no attempt to make sure that certain words appear in the story. The story is not seeded with words we want to teach students. Rather, we just simply tell the story. Given enough stories presented with comprehension aiding supplementation, part of what we call optimal input, all the frequent and as well as infrequent vocabulary the students are ready to acquire will be present and in sufficient quantity to support acquisition. A little more, this is the last slide for the story listening. What is story listening? So full acquisition does not happen after only one exposure, but gradually builds up. That's the reason why we tell lots of stories. Each time acquired see or hear a new word or expression in a comprehensible context, a small part of it is acquired. With a sufficient amount of input, this small increase is enough to lead to substantial acquisition. Oh, I guess I had one more. So what is story listening? There is there is no attempt to make sure that certain words appear in the story. Oh, I told this. Sorry about this. So I'm going to put acquisition. I did this. Okay. So what is story listening? It is based on the input hypothesis. So it was written in Dr. Krashen's book in 1982, 1985, and 2003. The hypothesis states input is the cause of language acquisition, and it alone is sufficient. That's the hypothesis. Now, what is the goal of story listening program, of story listening with, well, it's not story listening program. It is really a reading program. Story listening was added later to the reading program. And the goal of the program is high intermediate for most students. Okay. Students will be able to read authentic books written at the 5th and 6th grade reading level. That is the goal. And if we are interested in standardized tests, my goal, or the goal, is to have the students score between 80 to 100 on the internet-based TOEFL, or they score 650 to 900 on the TOEIC by the time or before they leave the program. Now, it has been a lot of confusion or misunderstanding among the teachers about comprehensible input. Dr. Krashen said in 1982 already, comprehensible input alone is not sufficient, is not enough. Input hypothesis said input is sufficient, but input meant optimal input. There are other characteristics that encourage acquisition at the fastest possible rate. It has to be optimal input, and it cannot be just comprehensible input. An activity or method that fits none of them could result in zero acquisition or very little acquisition. It means if the methodology had only comprehensible input, you cannot expect good results. Oops, no, where am I going? Here, okay. What is optimal input? Optimal input has 4 characteristics. The first one is, of course, comprehensible. Now, this is all written in the book 1982, page 63. Optimal input is comprehensible. Number 2 is compelling. Dr. Krashen changed the wording from interesting to compelling about 10 years ago. So optimal input is highly interesting. And another one is rich. In the book in 1982, it is stated as it is not grammatically sequenced syllabus, but we would like to call it rich input. Optimal input contribute to the message and flow of the story or text. And rich input adds context to make the story or text more comprehensible, making it more compelling, helping acquisition automatically contains I+1. This is the very important part. The rich input, when it is delivered in a using the special strategy, it contains automatically I+1. Well, that's not said, maybe it was not said like that in page 68, but something similar. Abundant, optimal input must be in sufficient quantity. These things are all written 40 years ago. Okay, teaching materials for optimal input. It used to be said that we didn't have, or they didn't have any materials to teach using optimal input because they were only thinking about textbooks. But now we have discovered stories and books can provide optimal input. Story listening method is the one who uses stories. Story listening method can provide optimal input because it uses a written text of a story, and it uses a prompter and comprehension aiding supplementation. How does it? Oops, yeah. Okay, strategy to provide optimal input. Comprehension aiding supplementation, as I said, as it was mentioned earlier, we use linguistic and non-linguistic supplementation. It is not just synonyms and antonyms. It needs explanations and comments to expand for future acquisition. Drawings, very important. The manner of speech is very important. Knowledge of the world for students, for them to be able to predict, is very important. And we also use translation and other things. Okay. Is optimal input alone sufficient? Okay. The goal to reach the high intermediate in a few years, if the goal is to reach the high intermediate in a few years in school, it seems like the optimal input alone is sufficient. Did I do it right? Yeah, okay. Okay, there are two different approaches in our field. Input approach and eclectic approach. Now, input approach, I would say, story listening, GSSR, input approach. And other things that the people do, teachers do, are eclectic approach. Everybody agrees that we need input. So story listening approach says, yes, we need input. Other methods, they say, oh, yes, we need input. But then the second hypothesis, or second part of the hypothesis, says we don't need anything else but input, but we need output. And the input hypothesis says no, but eclectic approach says yes. Now, differences are, as you can see these activities that are included in the eclectic approach. One of them, for the top one, is pre-teaching of vocabulary. Story listening and GSSR say, no, we don't do that. But other methodologies do it, pre-teaching of vocabulary. Before the students read a book, they teach words, or before they listen to a story, they teach the words that the teacher is going to use. We don't do that in story listening. Comprehension questions. We never ask her comprehension questions, such as, what was the name of the girl who was in the story? Where did this girl go in the afternoon, type of thing. Comprehension questions, no questions asked. Drills and artificial repetitions, we don't do that. Conscious teaching of the words, we don't do that. Conscious teaching of the grammar, we don't do it. Interaction and negotiation, we don't do it. Teacher targets the words and grammar of the day. There are nothing like that. Post-SL activities, we have no activities after story listening. Daily or weekly tests, no daily tests, no weekly vocabulary tests. Error correction, of course there are no error corrections because there are no output. We don't use any games, movies, plays, and we don't, I mean you can, but we don't do that as a core program. Games, movies, plays, and music. Or speaking in L2 in the target language, or writing in the target language. As you can see, story listening and GSSR, everything we say no, but the other programs, they include these things. Okay. Now, extra activities to drill grammar and vocabulary before, during, and after story listening have not been shown to help. The order of presentation is not the order of natural acquisition. See, this is the natural order hypothesis. Consciously learned rules and vocabulary are not retained well and are only available when students have time, understand the rules, and are thinking about the rules. This is the monitor hypothesis. So, which would you like to? Which would we like to choose? Eclectic approach or input-only approach? Eclectic approach uses textbooks and stories. Textbook with stories. There are lots and lots of stories. You know, they not lots of stories, but they use stories in these textbooks. But we only use stories in books. There was a study in Taiwan. I talk about this all the time. Our colleagues in Taiwan, they did studies in 2007 and 2011. After 4 years of listening to stories read aloud to them, the children, elementary school children, began to read authentic books, such as books from the Marvin Red Post series. Professor Wang read stories, 65 storybooks to children. She started when the children were in the first grade. And by the time they were at the end of the fourth grade, they began to read Marvin Red Post series books. Storybooks are richer and more interesting. So these researchers in Taiwan compared 65 storybooks to other textbooks that were used in Taiwan in the elementary schools. What they found was the total words in the 65 storybooks were 24,698 words. But other books that were used in the elementary schools, they had much less number of words than the storybooks in 4 years. Head words types were much less in textbooks, and possible word families were much less than in stories, in 65 storybooks that they used. Okay. Oops. So stories and books contain rich language because the themes cover a wide range of topics. They talk about poverty, courage, true love, loyalty, friendship, mercy, secrets, disobedience, quarrels, jealousy, temptation, discipline, fidelity, faith, justice, patience, diligence, devotion, risk-taking, deception, betrayal, and many, many others. In every story, in every book, they contain different topics in different themes. The characters in the stories have many different professions: thief, woodcutter, hunter, ghosts, miller, moneylender, doctor, minister, priest, carpenter, farmer, innkeeper, wine shop owner, servant, sentinel, soldier, ogre, wicked stepmother, and of course, king, queen, prince, princess, witch, and wizard. Like Dr. Krashen talked the other day, when you read a novel, stories about a lawyer or I think he talked about John Grisham's book. When you read books like that, you learn a lot about laws. And so you can learn so much from reading books. Vocabulary acquisition rates from hearing a story. This has been said earlier, but Dr. Krashen and I did their paper in 2004, and the vocabulary acquisition rate was 0.25 word per minute. And then I replicated the study, 3 studies using Japanese students who were learning German as the second foreign language. And then I found the vocabulary rate, acquisition rate was from 0.10 to 0.25. And then we did another one in Denver, and it was American high school students who were learning Japanese as a foreign language, and the rate of vocabulary acquisition was 0.17 word per minute. And Professor Clark did that in 2019 in Japan, and it was 0.16. And Ken Smith, me, and Dr. Krashen wrote another paper, which was done in 2020 in Indonesia. It was 0.24 word per minute. And the one that I'm planning to publish next is 0.16 word per minute. But this study, these series of studies, I was motivated doing this by the work done by Dupy and Krashen in 1993. They wrote a paper called Incidental Vocabulary Acquisition in French as a Foreign Language. And they said the vocabulary acquisition rate was 0.15 word per minute. This really triggered my interest, and I did the study. I did the study many times. I replicated many times every year, and then finally I did this in 2004. Okay, so you might be interested in knowing how long does it take, and how much do they have to listen to stories, or how many books they have to read. Now, it has been estimated that 1,223 hours of reading will result in gaining 7,000 word families. It was done by Paul Nation's estimation, the paper. Another one is what we have done. It has been estimated that 1 hour of reading per day will result in a gain of 200 points on the TOEIC, which means 0.6 points per hour of reading on the TOEIC. This means if your students read 1 hour a day, every day for 300, maybe 50 days, they don't have to read 356 days, but if they read about 300 days, they can gain about 200 points on the TOEIC. Okay. And you might think 1 hour a day is too much. It isn't. Students can read 15 minutes in the morning, 15 minutes in the afternoon, 15 minutes in the evening, and 15 minutes at night before they go to bed. It's not that difficult. The vocabulary acquisition rates are estimated to be from 0.10 to 0.25 word per minute. And so it is easy to estimate how much you have to do, how much you have to have the students do. Stories and books contain more language, rich and abundant, than movies, songs, textbooks, games, playing with cards, and playing sports, or playing cooking, and having cooking class, and teach English, doing cooking in the kitchen type of thing. Reading has been reported to be the most efficient way to receive comprehensible input. This is not what we said. Somebody else said this. Paul Nation said this in 2014. What is a solid listening syllabus? Many people asked me, what's the syllabus? Stories that you choose for your students according to their interest and level is the syllabus. That's what Ignacio said last week. From short, easy, and simple to gradually longer, complex, and more interesting stories. This is the syllabus of story listening. How many stories? 100 is a reasonable goal. If you could tell a story, 100 stories in 1 year, you will see lots of difference in students' ability. Story listening will help prepare students for reading. Students will need some guidance at the beginning of the reading program, but eventually they will be reading 100 to 150 pages a week. Eventually, not eventually doesn't mean 3 or 4 years later. No, some students can become self-selected reader in 1 semester, at the end of the first semester. Some students may need 2 semesters, some students may need 3 semesters. Everybody's different. Some students might need 2 years to become a free voluntary reader, but it will happen if the guidance is right. It's done right. Story listening in GSSL class is in class, students listen to stories. And then if they have time left, they do reading. And then they also, if the time, Well, sometimes I had to do it outside of the class or after the class or somewhere else. But if you have time left in the classroom, you do guidance in the classroom. And at home, students read books. Evaluation. A lot of people asked, how do you evaluate the students when the students read different books and that they listen to different stories? You can do this very easily. You can do it by both ways, by 2 ways: observation, subjective observation, and objective observation, objective evaluation. Okay, reading. You look at the reading record notebook. You look at their notebook to see what they're reading, and then you do individual interview with the students, and then you ask them if they like the story, just like Ignacio said. Ask them, did you like the story? Instead of saying, did you understand the story? If you ask them if they understood, if they liked the story, if they said they didn't like it, they probably didn't understand it. If they said they liked it, that means they understood it. And then you can also give them a test. And I like Dr. Krashen said last week, not to give tests much and make it minimal, and I agree with it. But I happen to like to give tests. The reason why I like to give tests is because it is sometimes good for the students to actually see how much they are grown, they are developing, they are getting better. And so I give closed tests, summary writing tests, and vocabulary tests. And at my university, my students used to take standard TOEIC test when they came in, and before they left, they took the TOEIC test. Story listening and GSSR guided self-selected reading leads to SSR, self-selected reading. It is the Dr. Krashen's hypothesis, which is called the conduit hypothesis. Story listening and GSSR leads the students to become autonomous acquirer, autonomous reader. Guiding is necessary at the beginning. That's why I add the word, the word or the alphabet G before SSR. A long time ago in 1994, Dr. Kyung-Suk Cho and Dr. Krashen published a paper, which was this very famous paper called Sweet Valley Study. In the study, these Korean students acquired lots and lots of vocabulary from reading books called Sweet Valley Kids series. Dr. Cho guided her students from easier books to higher level books. So guiding is necessary. Conclusion: story listening and GSSR are based on the input hypothesis, and the reading hypothesis. The combination of listening and reading thus far has helped students reach high level of proficiency faster because it's optimal input than previous methods. These are the more references that you're interested. I have some references, it's on these pages. And this is the end of the presentation. Thank you. Okay, so this is the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mason, for sharing. The intention of the summary of SL came from some questions by viewers on wanting to know a little more information about the practice, the methodology, and the theory behind story listening and how it differs from storytelling. And just to clarify that story listening instructors do combine a reading program within their story listening curriculum. So we're not simply telling stories, it is combined with reading. In best practice, we would be giving kids books to read because the reading hypothesis shows that reading is the best way to acquire language. But this practice of story listening allows us as educators to build our students' ability up to a point where they can become autonomous readers, and that's the goal. And I wanted to apologize. Earlier I said Dr. Krashen will be talking about the believing versus the guessing game, which was incorrect. It's the believing versus the doubting game. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Stephen Krashen to tell us a little more about advancing the theory of second language acquisition, or just language acquisition theory.
Okay, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everybody. Nice to be back. At my age, it's nice to be anywhere. I was supposed to talk about advanced theory. That was the original plan, and I've changed it to advancing theory. I want to invest in the future and talk about how we can continue to make progress in our work and continue to understand what other people are doing. I'm indebted in this talk to a man named Peter Elbow. I've mentioned him before. Peter Elbow's a professor in the East Coast, and his amazing work in the creative process. He's the one who came up with the idea of the believing game and the doubting game. And one of the great moments of my life, my professional life, is when Peter Elbow and I were at the same conference, both speakers, and I was able to thank him for all the help he's given me. And I think I'm going to write him a note today, having gone through preparing for this talk. How are we going to get there? How are we going to continue to make progress? The magic word is theory. Now, when you use the word theory, just a moment, L'chaim, obviously Yiddish, okay? When you use the word theory, what people think of is something weak, something without evidence, something you just kind of thought up and are throwing out. It's the ideas you come up with when you've stayed up late drinking cheap wine. No, theory is just the opposite. Theory is hardcore science. We are dependent on theory, not something we make up without evidence, but something we have evidence for. This is how we make progress. Definition of theory, or sub-description. It's a set of hypotheses that are somehow interrelated, that depend on each other. A hypothesis. A hypothesis is really our most important work tool. I'm going to give two definitions. They seem opposite, but they're both correct. One definition of hypothesis is it's a guess. It's what you think might be true. The second is it's a prediction. It makes certain predictions as to what's going to happen. And what we do in our research is see if these predictions are right. There's a guy named Karl Popper, who is a very influential philosopher of science. He's the one who's basically influenced modern methodology. And I think he's half right and half wrong. And his work is extremely important, and we've all profited by it. Karl Popper says, you can never prove anything in science. Oh boy. You never can prove anything. Now, the press keeps saying, so-and-so has proved that the cause of the coronavirus is blah, blah, blah. No, even if you have very, very strong evidence, it's never proof. You can never see if all predictions are confirmed all the time, everywhere. I predict when I take this pen, which cost me 19 cents, and I drop it, it's going to fall. Therefore, I have proved that the gravity exists. I haven't dropped it enough times. Maybe if I do it 4 million times, maybe 4,000,001, it won't drop. You cannot look at every single case, but you can disprove. One piece of counter evidence can show that you're wrong. Science is a very dangerous game. You can never prove, oh, Krashen hasn't proved his theory. Of course not. We haven't proved anything yet, but we have supporting evidence. So far, no counter evidence, no evidence that says it's wrong. But all you need is one. Albert Einstein knew that. No amount of experimentation can ever prove me wrong. A single experiment, I'm sorry, let me say that again. Oh boy, I need more coffee. No amount of experimentation can ever prove me right. A single experiment can prove me wrong. One counter evidence, it's over. Here's an example I like to use, linguistics example. Let's say I'm a linguist, which I used to be, someone interested in grammar. I still like it. And I have a hypothesis, which is very common sense. in the struggle to find universals, I have a universal. I claim all languages have pronouns. It's a universal, which means that the child acquiring his or her first language is expecting pronouns, which helps explain why language acquisition is so quick with children, especially, and even adults. Well, let's say I have evidence for this hypothesis. I have proven it. I have looked at every single language spoken on Earth. Last night, I stayed up late and I looked at 4,285 languages, and they all have pronouns. I just made that number up, of course. Have I proven the hypothesis? Well, it looks good. It's universal, all languages. But a critic can say, well, actually, you don't know. Maybe there have been languages lost in history that didn't have pronouns. Maybe Proto-Indo-European, whatever, didn't have pronouns. The language has been lost. Nobody speaks it anymore. We don't have written records. Maybe it didn't have pronouns. Until we get a time machine, you're not gonna figure this out. And you can also say, maybe some language that has yet to be born, that is still developing, won't have pronouns. You can't know. You have to wait around and time travel to the future. For example, about 30 years ago, there's a great deal of publicity about Valley Talk, what young people in the San Fernando Valley, how they were speaking English. It actually did have pronouns. The masculine singular pronoun was dude. The feminine was babe, and that's what they used all the time. So the language keeps changing. Maybe Valley Talk someday won't have pronouns. We don't know. So it's still a hypothesis. And let's say a disaster happens to me as a pronoun person. I have based my entire career on pronouns. When I go to conferences, people point me out and say, there goes the pronoun man. And I give new evidence all the time, more languages with pronouns, etc. Become very famous. Then it happens, disaster strikes. 3 punk graduate students, ages 20 to 23, go to South America, to the Amazon Valley, and they find a language spoken by 5 people, all over the age of 95, no pronouns. What happens to my hypothesis? Disproven. What happens to my career? It's over. I am humiliated. How could he have been so stupid, etc. So what we do, we have a hypothesis. We see what the predictions are. We go out and see if it's true. You can have a million conversations. It still doesn't prove the hypothesis. You can never prove a hypothesis. Now, critics, this is wonderful for critics. Critics can appear to be very smart by playing what Peter Elbow calls the doubting game. You can always say, you know, I'm really not convinced. I'd like to see more evidence. Oh gosh, you always have some, I'm thinking of 4-letter words, I'm sorry. Oh, I'll try to be polite. Some jerk who sits in the back says, no, you've only looked at 4,862 languages. I'd like to see another 1,000 before I'm convinced, okay? Well, you can always say that. It's a cheap shot. Or they can always say, this is even more annoying. Oh, that's just theory. Everything is just theory. That's all we've got. Well, how do we make hypotheses? Now I've convinced you that having hypotheses and looking for predictions is a good thing to do. It's how we proceed, but it's dangerous. You can always be wrong. Sources of hypotheses. Where do we get our predictions? Anywhere. It doesn't matter. You don't have to get your ideas from research, from someone else. In fact, the studies show on creativity and all that, Keith Simonton is the best one to read on this. Scientists get their ideas from their own work in general. When they reread, revise their work, they come up with new ideas, and it basically comes from their own stuff, which is kind of reassuring. Doesn't mean it's right. So science says you see if the hypotheses are correct, you see if the predictions are what you expected. There are 3 ways of doing this, and I like all 3. I'm a minority here. You can do experiments. Experiments are done according to procedures of science. where you eliminate potential counterexamples, etc., potential confounds rather, ways of confusing things. The way to do that is the experiment. We call the true experiment, sometimes not quite so rigorous, but experiments are very good. I'm all for them. I do them all the time. Experiments are considered scientific. So if you want to have a hypothesis, and the hypothesis, one of my favorites is coffee makes you more productive, wakes you up in the morning. You give coffee to 20 people who are groggy in the morning, and you see how they are in about an hour or 20 minutes, and take blood tests and look at their brain waves and all that. And you can test that. You can see if it's true. You have one group that does the coffee, one group that doesn't, and you can get pretty good evidence that way. So experiments are the way people do it, and they claim this is the only way. If you take classes in methodology and science, they will focus on experiments exclusively. There are two other ways of doing it: case histories and anecdotes. I deeply respect both of these ways. They're not as good as experiments. Only a true experiment where you have controls, etc., can test a hypothesis. But case histories and anecdotes, even though they're not as clean, they're important. In my opinion, they provide a test that a hypothesis must pass if the case history and anecdotes are discussed in some detail. So let's say someone tells me, my cousin went to another country and read a lot and talked to a lot of people, got lots of comprehensible input, and he now speaks fluent Spanish, therefore comprehensible input is right. Well, it's suggestive. It's a test that this hypothesis passes, okay? It doesn't eliminate all possible alternative explanations. Maybe he took a grammar class that he didn't tell you about. Ken Smith, who's here today for listening to the talk, published a really interesting paper on this. It was called King Felix. Ken checked into a hostel, a little hotel in Taiwan, where he was there for a while and wanted to save a little money. And in the hostels, you get a roommate. And his roommate introduced himself, says, "My name is Felix." And Ken said, "You mean Felix the cat?" "No, King Felix the baseball player." They had a great conversation in English. No problem. This guy was eager to speak English and comfortable with it. He got English by watching broadcasts of Major League Baseball, which he found, just as Dr. Mason told us about, compelling, comprehensible, and highly compelling. The guy was a baseball fanatic, as I was when I was 13 years old. I still haven't quite gotten over it. You say, well, that's, and Ken points this out in the paper. This is a hypothesis. This is interesting. It is supporting evidence. But we didn't really interrogate Felix about what he did in his spare time. Didn't say, "Did you ever study grammar?" We don't have any evidence what he did on his own. We didn't follow him around to see if he was going to a grammar class. We didn't go into his bedroom to see if he had a copy of a grammar book by his bedside or a dictionary. So it's a test that comprehensible input passes, which is important. If it had failed the test, we'd be in big trouble. But it doesn't eliminate all alternatives, but they are important. They are very important. I found the article to be super interesting and helpful. So we can get this in any one of these ways. They are all helpful. Karl Popper, let's say Ken Smith hangs around the hostel and finds and makes friends with all of King Felix's buddies, and they all did the same thing. And then we look at other case histories. People like Kyung-Suk Cho, Beniko Mason have gathered these case histories, and you find the same thing. The people who are good all said they got lots of input, they did lots of reading, etc. Well, what does Karl Popper say about all this? Now, look at all these tests that it's passed. Look at all the supporting evidence. Popper is not impressed. He says that doesn't matter. You can have 5,000 case histories, replications, even confirming experiments, and that one counterexample can still show up. Then what? You're dead. In fact, Popper makes the case that replication doesn't matter. You can replicate something 500 times experimentally. It still doesn't prove anything. Well, he's right. but replication is very good. Let me talk about replication for a while. Extremely important. The field is unimpressed with replication. On the handout, I quote a book. I used the title of the book, Replication Research in the Social Sciences, James Newley. It's very good. He has chapters, it's a good book, though, about the philosophy of replication, the statistics of replication, and statements from journals about how they won't accept replications, how they don't publish them, which is really sad. I think it's because replications are too easy to understand and you can do it short, and journals like things that are long and complicated, which is really a pathology in the profession. This is important. Every replication not just adds data, but makes the case stronger. I fell in love with something called meta-analysis in the 1970s, thanks to a friend of mine, Ed Purcell, who really got me into statistics. It was wonderful. I think the reason I like statistics so much, there are two reasons. Number one, I have a background in math. So when I see all the technical terminology, it doesn't frighten me. In fact, I was a math major for a while, took calculus, advanced calculus, all this stuff. And I never took a class in statistics. I did it by myself, thanks to the books that Ed Purcell showed me, which are pretty clear. Not like most statistics books are written by maniacs, let me tell you. I have a hard time understanding them. I found out that a couple of statistics books I was trying to understand were really the statisticians. This is in a first course statistics book. They were really arguing against other statisticians, saying my method is better than your method, you did this wrong. And if you're a beginner, you have no idea what they're talking about. Very confusing. They bring in mathematics, formulas, matrix algebra, which was the last math course I took after doing advanced calculus. So this is what we're up against. The easy statistics books, though, the good ones, which I have read, try the SAGE series, S-A-G-E, Frederick Wolf's book on meta-analysis. Very good. With high school algebra 1 year, you should be fine. Anyway, when you look at this stuff, they tell you that when you replicate a study, it makes it far more impressive. It makes it more reliable, less likely that it happened by chance. And there's a formula for calculating this, and it's in Wolf's meta-analysis book. Okay, for those of you who had statistics, fine, follow this. Those of you who haven't, just relax for a moment, repeat your mantra. If you have two studies, and one study finds the result is significant at the 0.03 level, and you have another study where it is insignificant at the 0.30 level, it's still there though. If you combine them, there's a formula you can use, it's 0.02 level. It's even more unlikely to have happened by chance. This is how you do meta-analysis. I haven't done this analysis yet, but when we put together all the studies on story listening and the effect of vocabulary through story listening and adding formal instruction to it, drills and exercises, I'm going to combine all the p-values, and you're going to see that it's even more impressive and more reliable. So this is very good. We disrespect replication. If you're going to start out in science and doing research, you want to do experimental, start out by doing a few easy replications. See if they work. You learn scientific method, then publish the results, whether they're positive or negative, and you're making a real contribution. So this is Karl Popper. Science is only done when we have a prediction and we test it to see if it's right. This is an application of what we call the doubting game. Try to find mistakes. Be eager to find other people's mistakes. We all know people who have this as a lifestyle. Find out what you're doing wrong. Emerson, who is that? Our pal Ralph Waldo Emerson, essayist, poet, fiction writer, etc. What a remarkable guy. Here's what he said. The value of a principle is the number of things it will explain, not just replication, but seeing if it explains things, especially things it wasn't intended to explain. You have a hypothesis that not only works for your group, for your idea, but for other ideas and other things. We have profited from this. I have profited from this. For example, I gave a talk last time My sermon last week was about the silent period, and the major part of it was talking about the silent period in humans, of course, people acquiring second language, people allowed to be quiet for a while they get comprehensible input and are not forced to speak. I looked at animal research, and I found the silent period is there too. This applies to animals acquiring animal codes, systems of communication, vervet monkeys doing alarm calls. Okay, alarm calls are a call they get from their other animals by watching them, and the alarm call is related to a certain predator. This is not where with the vervet monkeys when they're born, they pick this up from the others. So one kind of call, you're really told to run away. Another called climb a tree. The predator can't climb. The other one, hide in a bush. Predator can't see very well. So they learn these things from each other, but for a long time, they simply listen and they watch how other monkeys react. Silent period. I found this was true in an African gray parrot. So this isn't proof, but it's quite impressive, I think. And most interesting, mentioned this already, when a hypothesis explains results, it wasn't specifically designed for, I have to pause here because I have to talk about a paper I'm still bitter about. You are my therapist today. I'm still really, the technical term is pissed off, and I'm still pissed off. I wrote a paper, the editors, it was not their fault. It's the fault of the publisher, etc. I was invited to contribute a paper in a book called Input Matters. You get the ambiguity, input is important, and matters about input, things about input. And it was an edited volume, and since input was my whole thing for a while, still is, I was invited to do a paper, and today I write short papers. I didn't that in those days. I had a lot of fun with this paper, let me tell you, and this is part of my presentation today. I'm not wandering off. I included everything I could find. I started out with adult second language, which is where we got the input hypothesis. I showed the same effects were true of child second language, thanks to Heidi Dulé, Marina Burt, started the ball rolling. And then I found it was true of first language and language and literacy, Ken Goodman, Frank Smith's work, etc. So there it was. Things I was not, when I started this input hypothesis, comprehensible input, I wasn't thinking about literacy. I wasn't thinking about children. I was thinking about the adults that I encountered at Queens College and the university there. But lo and behold, as you move through, you find it applies to other things, not just different age groups, but different areas of language. I was at the USC library. I spent a lot of time in the old education library. The education library used to have its own special room. Isn't that wonderful? And I would work there, small, comfortable place. And they had print journals on the shelves, which was wonderful. Oh gosh, this was in the 70s, before everything was PDF and electronic and all that, which has its own virtues, no question. In fact, it's made life a lot easier in many ways. But what I do during breaks is get up, wander through. My idea of doing leisure, fun reading is to look at old journals. I found the area where college English was there, the English journal, the language arts journals, the papers published by teachers of language arts, first language arts, and professors who did work in language arts. So much good work. Oh my goodness. And I started reading the 1890s, the early 1900s. I found these amazing articles. The first couple I found had to do with spelling. Articles published in 1892, 1902. One was called The Futility of the Spelling Grind. They looked at kids in elementary school, English as a first language, and all their spelling test scores for years and years, starting, 1860, going up to 1890, columns and columns, how kids in one class did, kids in the other. And they compared classes that had spelling instruction and classes that didn't have spelling instruction. Sometimes the groups that didn't have spelling instruction were because the kids were already good spellers, but other times it was just random. So it was good experimental design. In those days, in 1892, 1898 and 1902, they didn't have the statistical tools that we have today. The things like t-tests and correlations and simple regression, they didn't have that. Certainly didn't have multivariate multiple regression. That started in the 1920s with agricultural research. So what I did, and this is with my former student, Howard White, we entered the data and put it into the mighty USC computers. In those days, you had to put it all on cards. And guess what? Oliver Kornman, all these people were absolutely right. There was no effect for spelling instruction, tested in a variety of ways. What I did was called a secondary analysis, going back over old data. And then I looked at other papers, other research, and there's some evidence even then that spelling came from reading. And that was the conclusion. And I updated our paper. We updated our paper to include all the data that spelling comes from reading, that reading and spelling are correlated, etc. This is wonderful. This is a hypothesis designed for syntax, for grammatical morphemes, etc. It worked for more than syntax. It worked for spelling. We found also it worked for vocabulary acquisition. Vocabulary comes from reading. This has been replicated again and again, most spectacularly by Jeff McQuillan. Phonics. This was Frank Smith's idea, Ken Goodman's idea, that most of our knowledge of phonics comes from reading. The rules are too complex to be taught, etc. So we did not design the hypothesis to look at these fields, but it turned out to be right. In fact, Goodman Smith said this years before I arrived on the scene. A wonderful day in my life was when I discovered a book called Reading Without Nonsense by Frank Smith. And I had been, talking about my theory for like 10 years by then. And I just discovered this book, got it in the local student bookstore at San Antonio University where I was giving a talk. I read it in one sitting. There it was, all my hypotheses, beautifully stated by Frank Smith, much more clearly than I did. He didn't know my work. I didn't know his work. The data was crystal clear. All this stuff from reading, vocabulary, phonics comes from comprehensible input, from understanding what's on the page. So this was beautiful for a hypothesis and beautiful for my point. It explains something that it wasn't designed to explain. Now, what happens, I'm telling you about how wonderful replication is, what happens when you fail to replicate, where it doesn't seem to come out? Well, the obvious reason is that your hypothesis is wrong. I'll get to that. But what you do first is you try to find out why. When you do that, sometimes you find a deeper hypothesis. There's nothing like that. This is how we make progress. For example, most of my waking hours in the late 1960s, early 70s were investigating something called the natural order of grammatical morphemes. Studies, Roger Brown in first language, Dulé and Burt in second language, found that for grammatical markers, some items come early. For example, the progressive marker, John is playing the violin. Third person singular comes late. Could be 6 months to a year in first language until third person singular comes. And this is there all over the place. Well, Diane Larson Freeman, who was at UCLA at the time, did a dissertation on this. And there's lots of useful data in her dissertation. She tried to find the natural order to see if it was there in different conditions. It was there for, unmonitored writing, etc. But it wasn't there when you gave someone a grammar test. This led to a deeper hypothesis. My hypothesis then, golden moment, and it was driven by a apparent counterexample. I didn't prove I was right, but it was stated as a hypothesis. Since then, it's been replicated. Again, you can't prove anything. You get it in an unmonitored, you get the natural order in an unmonitored situation with free speech, with unmonitored writing, certain things like the bilingual syntax measure, which promote free speech, et cetera, where the people are not focused on form, you get the predictable order. When you give people a grammar test, you focus on form, grammar pops in. influences, you no longer get the natural order. Things that are easy to learn, like third person singular, rise in rank and disturb the natural order. From this, the monitor hypothesis was born. The idea that we use conscious grammar as an editor, and you have to make it work, you got to know the rule, you have to have thought time, you have to be thinking about form. This Diane Larson Freeman's work was the one that got me thinking in this direction. So you have a counterexample, take a good look. It may turn out, though, that you're really wrong. This happens. Let me quote the leader of the field of linguistics and the founder of the field of linguistics, Noam Chomsky, still brilliant at age 91. Chomsky said, "There's nothing wrong with being wrong." Isn't that liberating? That's the name of the game. There's a misunderstanding, I think, of what a hypothesis is. When I first announced comprehensible input, and this was in workshops between UCLA and USC, which were very, very interesting. We got together, discussed, it was like once a month. I was at USC. UCLA had a group of new scholars, just came there. John Schumann, Dan Larson Freeman just came there. This was, in my opinion, the loyal opposition, who made very good points. And Evelyn Hatch was there, one of the great pioneers of our field. So we went back and forth on this stuff. There was a feeling in the group that one of the big problems with my work was that I wasn't cautious. I was being wild. I was stating these things when there wasn't enough evidence to support them, etc. A reluctance to state a hypothesis. I think this is a mistake. I think you should always be willing to state a hypothesis. It doesn't have to be right. It has to be useful, which means it stimulates good research. So come up with your ideas. Don't be afraid to state them in public. There's nothing wrong with being wrong. There's nothing wrong with making a mistake. Everybody makes mistakes. That was a Sesame Street song. Your sister and your mother. Okay. Wonderful quote from one of the great mathematicians of the last century. He was at the University of Texas, John Tate. My son got to know him. My son is a mathematician. When my son was a graduate student and he knew Tate, and all the graduate students and all the faculty admired him, this guy had an impeccable reputation. What is the opposite of impeccable? Peccable? I don't know. I've never heard that. Anyway, John Tate, someone once asked him, again, this guy had a fabulous reputation as an algebra expert. Someone once asked him, "What do you do all day? How's your work day?" And he says, "Well, about 1/3 of the time, I'm making good progress. About 1/3 of the time, I'm making mistakes. And about 1/3 of the time, I'm thinking, how could I be so stupid?" This is John Tate, total master of the field, recognized master worldwide. Donald Campbell, expert in statistics and design. Too many potential creators are inhibited by a belief that gifted others solve problems directly, that they just sit around and come up with great ideas. Oh, you publish so much. It must come very easily to you. No. People like me put in more time, I got to tell you that. And we're wrong most of the time, constantly. And we have learned that this is part of the scientific process. My colleague, Susan Ohanian, very insightful former teacher, mostly expert on language arts, but learning in general. I really love her books. In fact, I used to subscribe to Teacher Magazine only to get her column. Her husband, Hans Ohanian, is a physicist. Turns out, coincidence? I don't think so. Turns out my son happened to have Ohanian's textbook on his shelf right there, Small World. Anyway, Hans wrote a book about Albert Einstein, which I read. It was wonderful, called Einstein's Mistakes, The Human Failings of Genius. Well, the press loved the title, and Susan Ohanian sent me a copy because she knew I was interested in Einstein's life. And I wrote some comments on it, and I made this comment. I said, it's kind of the wrong title. Hans Ohanian made a mistake. The title of the book is not the way it should be. The book is not just Einstein's mistakes. It reveals the wondrous and twisted roads that lead to knowledge. It was all about the scientific method and what goes on, how Einstein progressed. One of my favorite stories is Einstein, in this book, Ohanian talks about it. Einstein wrote a paper about relativity. This is in the middle of his career, submitted it to a journal with equations, the whole thing. Then 1 year later, he wrote a paper saying, last year's version was wrong. Here's the new one, corrected the math. The next year, he rewrote the paper, same thing. He did it 4 times, saying last year's version was wrong, 4 years in a row. This is a scientist. I have a friend, he's a linguistics friend, and he had a stamp which he put on his papers as he sent them out to his colleagues, just, so they could read it. And it said, this does not represent my current position. We are always changing. We are always finding mistakes. We're always revising. Remember that from the composing process? You see your own work, you see where you need to make corrections, and that's where you make progress. Again, there's nothing wrong with being wrong. Charles Darwin, in his autobiography, which was edited by his son, I think, he says, I cannot remember a single first form hypothesis which had not, after a time, to be given up or greatly modified. Every idea he's had, nearly, he's had to modify, to change. This is not quite correct. Now, when I was a grad student, what we did in linguistics, I was a linguistics graduate program, what we did was to read Noam Chomsky. That's basically 90% of what we did. And we got really good at reading Chomsky, and it was amazing. It was from Chomsky I learned philosophy of science. I learned how a scientist works, going from paper to paper, making changes, etc. I'll tell you what I did, which is another advertisement for narrow reading. The course I took in syntax, which was right after I took general linguistics, our textbook was Aspects of the Theory of Syntax, which came out in 1965. I opened it up, started to read it. I understood nothing, zero. It could have been written in Bulgarian. I had no idea. I then did something which turned out to be the right thing. I put Aspects of the Theory of Syntax aside, and I went to the bookstore and the library, and I found Chomsky's earliest publications that were available. A book called Syntactic Structures, a thin book. I still have it on my shelf up here. It was the introduction to his theory, his first attempts to do transformational grammar, and why, his first discussion of universals, etc. It was comprehensible. It was for an audience not familiar with all his work because he hadn't published it yet. I read that book. It took about 2 weeks, and it was only about 45, 50 pages, and it was slow. I read it twice, underlined, but it wasn't that hard. I really did get through it. Then I went, this was like in the late 50s. Then I went to his next paper. I remember reading another manuscript, a long journal paper. Don't remember the name. I'll wake up at 3 in the morning and remember, and I'll call every one of you up and tell you what it was. And it was the next step in Chomsky's work. After that, I read Aspects of the Theory of Syntax. Having read Syntactic Structures, this other paper, a couple of other things, I'll tell you about them. When I went back to Aspects of the Theory of Syntax, the word is transparent. It was obvious because I was familiar with his work and I had seen the step by, this Chomsky on the phone, that I had seen the step-by-step that had led to what he was saying in Aspects of the Theory of Syntax. So we also read, all of our students, we also read I hope you're all writing down this phone number because I'm not. Oh God, more, how many of these do you get every day? Well, anyway, I also read the criticisms of Chomsky, which were in the professional journals. And these were by other scholars. And what I realized is that they hadn't read Chomsky. They hadn't understood what he was saying. We as students all understood what Chomsky was saying. We had read his book. I had read it, piece by piece by article. They hadn't played the believing game at all for trying to understand what was going on. This is fascinating. The people who actually wrote criticisms of Chomsky, which Chomsky very cheerfully admitted, were his students. People like us who were students directly and indirectly, who had sat down and tried to understand the work, tried to believe it. This is what Elbow calls the believing game. They had tried to believe it and apply it to other areas. They had tried to extend it, exactly what Karl Popper says is a waste of time. They played the believing game. They made the difference. And in Chomsky's later papers, you see, well, I had this idea for that. It was wrong. And it was because of so-and-so, who turned out to be one of his students or a colleague who understood his work, etc. To me, this explains Elbow's important concept, the believing game and the doubting game. An essay he wrote as an appendix to Writing Without Teachers, a beautiful book. He's also posted several articles about it on ResearchGate, and you can get them. The doubting game is what we play. Elbow says it has a monopoly. The doubting game, you try to be as skeptical and as analytic as possible. Being skeptical is considered very intelligent and very competent. Prove someone is wrong. I had a student, a colleague who was a graduate student of the university. I'm not going to mention her name because I don't want to badmouth her professors. Yes, I do, but I won't. She did a paper looking at natural order and found that the natural order fell apart in one place. Her professor was so proud of her. He posted on notes all over the place saying, "My student has disproved Krashen. Isn't that wonderful?" Well, I looked at her data and it was just like Dan Larson Freeman's. It was where when you focus on form, you find these differences and exactly predictable. And I think it confirmed this important monitor hypothesis. But the fact that he was so thrilled about it, the professors, shows the dominance of the doubting game. The believing game is what we want to do. I say we do both. I have deep respect for Popper. I think Popper was very right in some ways, and I do play the doubting game a lot. We also need to play the believing game. How do you do it? How do you enter into the believing game? This is how you do it. And I got my good example of this from the loyal opposition back in UCLA, USC, our back and forth, and this was in the early days of the theory. I had some conversations with a professor on the other side at UCLA, John Schumann, who became quite a leader of the field, did good research. We got along very well. And he told me, "I don't understand what you're doing, Steve. I don't understand." He should have said Steve John because he speaks Farsi as well. Anyway, and I'm trying to understand it. That to me was beautiful. He said, "I wish I could enter into your mind and see it the way you do." That to me was a perfect example of trying to play the believing game. And John really did try. Well, I don't think we came to complete agreement on everything, but it was very reassuring to know that people had this attitude towards someone else's work, and that inspired me to try to do the same thing. What he told me was, and this is exactly what Elbow says you should say, "Tell me more about that. I'm trying to see things the way you do. We need both." Well, this is the core of my presentation, but I have a couple of other things to say, of course. I want to talk about public's point of view and new data and old data. Old data first. What graduate students are implicitly and sometimes explicitly told is you got to get new stuff. Do a new experiment with new subjects. This is what you do, get a grant. The university loves it when you get a grant because they get a big chunk of the money and the dean can spend it on anything the dean wants to spend it on. It's great stuff. So they're very interested in your getting grants. And universities, in very many cases, my former university being the leader, have turned into this business where you're there to make money and grants are the way you do it. And I never did that. I like to look at old data. do secondary analysis, and meta-analysis, which I think are the ways to go. And when I needed data, I used co-authors. I shamelessly admit this. And the data, what I gathered myself, was easy to do. I didn't need a grant. I didn't want to take money from the government when they needed it for cancer research, when I could do this by asking people a few questions. So I was very interested in old data, and I looked at old studies, as you know. Great insight by Morris Halley. Morris Halley was Noam Chomsky's buddy. They, MIT, and Morris, call him Morris, was into phonology. And he and Noam Chomsky wrote a book called Sound Patterns of English, which was the leading book in phonological theory, really pushed it. We all got it right away, sat down. Those days you could afford books. We all sat down, read it, underlined it, discussed it in class, et cetera. And when it came out, the professors just assumed we should start reading it. Everything changed. It was a very good idea because the book really teaches you about phonology and how to do theory. Now, I remember someone telling me, this is hearsay, that Halley gave a talk at the university and brought in some old data that came out from years ago that confirmed this point. And someone raised their hand and says, this is old stuff. Why don't you give us the new stuff? And Halley said, I'm not here to bring you the news. I'm here to bring you the truth. Old data, once again, counts, no question. The value, and old data, let's say you have a hypothesis and you're about to do an experiment, then you find an article published 5 years ago, someone else did the study and got the results you would expect. That counts, that is confirmation. If you do it again, it is replication. Old data absolutely counts, saying it again. There's two ways of doing it. Secondary analysis, which I did with the spelling stuff. And that's what Einstein did. Einstein didn't have a laboratory. What he did was studies published 10, 20 years ago and reanalyzed their data. And that was supportive of his theories of relativity, photoelectric effect, et cetera. So that stuff really counts, and it's the responsible thing to do. Then there's meta-analysis. I briefly mentioned that. That's going through lots and lots of old studies, converting each study into one number. How large was the effect? Grouping them all together, looking at everything at once. I'll come back to that. This is not just an option, just something you may want to do. But this is how progress is made. Keith Simonton, his books on genius and creativity. Oh, I've got so dependent on his stuff. He asks the question, when you look at scientists, eminent famous scientists, who are considered representative of the spirit of the times, the zeitgeist, like Margaret Mead in anthropology, Noam Chomsky in linguistics, Einstein, et cetera, would you say these people are with the times or ahead of the times? The obvious answer, no, they're ahead of the times. They're looking forward. The answer, according to Simonton, is neither. They're behind the times. They're looking at ideas that are no longer the fad, no longer fashionable, ideas that they've gotten interested in and they don't let them go. This certainly describes Noam Chomsky, who got involved with thinking of Descartes and innateness, and he wrote a book called Cartesian Linguistics, and he stayed with it. His work he considered to be following in the tradition of innatist philosophy, etc. So go back into the past, don't give it up. I gave you my examples. Let me give you another example of the value of meta-analysis. Anne Willig in 1985, magnificent paper, Bilingual Education. Bilingual education has been a point of controversy. The claim that we make, a claim that's nearly unknown, is that if you do bilingual education properly, children in bilingual classes do better in English, say in the United States, where English is the target language and the kids say are Spanish speakers. Kids who get a lot of their education in Spanish and some in English do better in English than children who do all English, so-called immersion, really submersion. And the philosophy behind that, which I worked on in those days, said bilingual education is closer to optimal input, it gives you comprehensible input and things you understand. You give them background knowledge, let's say in math, teach a course in Spanish and math, then they take more math in English, they know the terminology, they know what it's about, they understand more, etc. Get some background knowledge. A lot of you have done this trick. You want to read a book in another language, it's too hard. You read the first chapter in your own language. And then you go on, you've got some background knowledge, it's more comprehensible, the value of series books, etc. The big study there was done by Grace McField, 2013. My student, of course, I thought it was the best study, of course. And it's in ResearchGate, check it out. So our meta-analyses done beginning with Ann Willig in 85 and the most recent with the McFields confirm, if you look at all the studies on bilingual ed, one group does bilingual ed, the other does all English. And if it's set up right, if the statistics are done right, bilingual education is a consistent winner. It's one of the most stable results we have in the field of education. It is really true. The problem is the public totally disagrees. Brilliant paper done by our brilliant friend Jeff McQuillan and his brilliant wife Lucy Say. Paper they did as grad students, 1996. Bilingual education, does research matter? An analysis of media opinion on bilingual education. They looked at what the research was on bilingual education, that it works, done in the 1980s and 1990s. And they looked at newspaper articles and magazine articles. The media was solidly against bilingual education. I was criticized in the media a lot. I was criticized in an editorial in the Wall Street Journal. Can you imagine? My mom was so pleased. My son was mentioned in the Wall Street Journal. They said, how could people believe this ridiculous or even entertain this ridiculous hypothesis? If you teach someone something in Spanish, they're going to get better in English. It cannot be. Overwhelmingly negative on bilingual education. I call this the McQuillan-Say effect on bilingual ed, and we see it over and over. Why is it true? Why don't we who know better react to it? The people who know better, people who know the best are the school people, the teachers who deal with it all the time. When we came out with our first books, papers, articles on bilingual education, talking about why it works, and the meta-analyses came out, teachers agreed with us right away. They say, you're just telling me what I already know. I've seen it again and again. Child comes in, you explain it in the first language where the class in English won't be comprehensible, and they do a lot better. So the teachers did not, though, come to our defense. There's good reason why. I cut teachers a lot of slack. I give them a break. Teachers are so unbelievably pressured and overworked. They don't have time to sit and have a cup of coffee. They don't have time to go to the bathroom during the day. They don't have time to have a family life. They're busy preparing for the next day. And they're constantly being criticized by administrators who don't have the experience with children that they do. So teachers, in a word, are overwhelmed. And if they do want to write something, it's, oh God, it looks so hard, articles so long. One of my fantasies is that teachers will get used to, if they have time, take it easy, writing a short note in the journals saying, this is my experience, and this is right. This is what the McField said, okay, etc. Doctors do this all the time. If you look at medical journals, and someone comes out with a new treatment, for infection of this or that, a doctor will write in a short letter, say, this so-and-so recommended this medication, this salve. I'm a dermatologist. I tried it on 8 patients. 6 of them, it worked great. 2 of them, there was a slight allergic reaction. You might want to look into this. So that's what physicians do when they have time. They're overworked too. I can't cure the problem of teachers not having time, but if we can make it a little bit easier. Scholars, most scholars did not come to our defense, even those who knew better. They were playing the doubting game. You don't make any points. You don't score in academia by saying someone else is right. And when they do it, they're very shy about it. They don't publish papers. the phonics controversy has been fascinating. The phonics controversy, which, as you'll see later, is largely stimulated by the media, newspaper reporters, not teachers, not people who are there. The articles are all anti. That's what gets in the media. What scholars do is they write brilliant, long-winded discussions. They post them on Facebook. They circulate them among their friends. When they do manage to get something in journals, the articles are really good. Jerry Coles, my buddy, did a really good one on phonics. It's long, and it was in a journal nobody really sees. But I passed it around as best I could. But these things don't get out because only the doubting game gives you credit. And they're very eager to see things that doubt rather than see things that confirm. And they all know that confirmation is not the way to go for your career. Now, what about newspaper reporters? Oh my, on the handout it says what my cousin told me. My cousin Carrie, first cousin once removed, Carrie got his bachelor's degree in journalism, University of Indiana. Oh, I shouldn't have said that because I'm going to badmouth all the faculty. Carrie told me when I was telling him about my problems with bilingual ed, he said, people who write newspaper articles and magazines articles, in his opinion, are arrogant. They think they're right. They think they know more. They have read the journals, they've read the articles, they think they get it. They understand it. And also, they get a reputation, not by saying someone's right, but by blaming people, insulting people, putting them down, and saying they're wrong. This happened in phonics. In phonics and bilingual ed, I'll give you the phonics first. We have been gathering data for years. Thank you for listening to all my problems, by the way. We've been gathering data for years, stimulated by Smith, Goodman, and a number of brilliant people, showing that phonics instruction is not that important, not that helpful. We don't really need it, and it is absorbed by reading, etc. Well, a reporter is not going to make a reputation by saying this is true. Instead, they're going to make a reputation by pointing out the few people who claim they found evidence supporting direct instruction of phonics. There are several dozen papers that say that. I have responded to them. The most interesting one was Elaine Garan, G-A-R-A-N. I refer to her discovery as the Garan effect. The US government in the year 2000 came out with this huge report, a panel on reading research. They got panel members to vote on what they like. This is always a disaster, let me tell you, because they got the most conservative people they could find, in my opinion. Anyway, the report said, phonics doesn't work, we have the evidence, here's all the research. Elaine Garan did something nobody else did, which I find beyond heroic, staggering. She read the whole report. It was like that thick, or that thick. She found the counter evidence in chapter 2, table G. Here's what she found. Heavy phonics instruction. Heavy phonics instruction. You will do better on some tests. The tests you do better on are not tests where you have to understand what you read. They're tests of knowing the rules of phonics. That means pronouncing words out loud in isolation, sometimes nonsense words. They do better on those tests when you consciously learn some of the rules. They don't do better on tests of reading comprehension, which is what you get in school after around grade 1 and grade 2, grade 3. So they do better in kindergarten and grade 1 on these tests where you're simply reciting the rules, pronouncing them out loud. I have said this in at least 50 letters to the editor. I say, yeah, phonics works, depends on the tests, okay? Jeff McQuillan has done it on his collection of articles, Backseat Linguist, et cetera, depends on the test. I do pretty well with letters to the editor. The average, batting average, you get about 5% in. That's what the newspapers tell us. We got 100 letters, we published 5, okay. I have managed in general to do better. I've managed around 10%. Most are turned down, they get so many, okay. And these are reporters and editors, they don't know the field that well. In phonics, out of the hundreds, stating this one point. I've gotten 2 published. One Australia and one in Oklahoma. I'm sure you haven't read them. I've passed them around, I've put them around, gotten nowhere. I'm still doing it. Whenever phonics is mentioned that it works, I say this one point. It works on where you're reading lists of words out loud. It doesn't work on reading comprehension. And people who do lots of reading do better in reading comprehension, and eventually they do better in phonics tests too. So you get both for the same price. Gotten nowhere on this, let me tell you. This is the problem. So all 3 groups, let me say one more thing about reporters. I have more nasty stuff to say about people. Was it Theodore Roosevelt's daughter who said, if you don't have anything nice to say about someone, sit next to me. This is what I'm doing. Went to a party. The party was given by a friend of ours from our synagogue. We have a very active, friendly, nice synagogue. And the musician that I play with sometimes put on a party. And one of the guests, synagogue person, brought her husband. When I met him, I recognized his name. He did not recognize mine. He is a columnist for, I would say, Class B newspapers in California, like the local Torrance, California, the local Bakersfield, California newspaper, not, the LA Times or the San Francisco Bee, all that stuff, but the less well-known. And when he writes something in one paper, it gets in all the others. It's syndicated that way. And one of his favorite things to write about is bilingual ed. And he had published many articles on bilingual ed, saying it's all wrong, it's terrible. I had written to him. And I have written letters to the newspapers saying he's wrong. I think one of them got in. The rest of them were turned down. He didn't recognize my name, and I'd always sent him copies, and he still didn't care. And we started chatting, told me what he did. And I said, how's it going? I said, do the university people, the researchers, ever comment on what you say? He says, yeah. What an annoyance. There's this one really crazy professor from San Diego, UC, San Diego. Oh no, San Diego State. And she's been sending me her data. She's nuts. I know this person. She's good. She's a professional. I have quoted her. She's one of us, let me tell you, speaking for the research community. She's careful. She analyzes her data. She presents it well. It is quite sound research. He didn't know it, but she was doing him a terrific favor. He just dismissed her as a kook, didn't even bother reading the articles. I eventually told him who I was. He didn't care, made no impression on him. I did get my revenge at the end. I couldn't help it. My wife appreciated what I said. She said I did the right thing. Excuse me. At the end, when we were all saying goodnight, his wife mentioned, we're all kind of in a circle. She said, God, when I first met my husband, I thought he was a jerk. And I had to say it. I said, that makes 2 of us. Anyway, so that felt good. This is why intensive phonics is still winning. It's the journalists. A journalist, Emily Hanford, got a big article published in the New York Times attacking phonics, not mentioning my counter arguments, not mentioning Elaine Guerin, and simply saying the people who believe in this are people who are intellectually lazy, doing the wrong thing in school. They're doing a disservice by not teaching intensive phonics. The research works. She didn't mention the counterexamples. That's the New York Times. I wrote a long response, spent all day on it, a day and a half. I sent it to her. She said, oh, thank you for your response. I think we will simply agree to disagree. I disagree. She didn't tell me why. Then she was interviewed by Public Broadcasting System. These places are considered the left establishment, the liberals. PBS interviewed her, put it on the air. I responded to everything. They didn't even acknowledge my response. And the biggest one, it's not too late on this one. I subscribe to Science News. I like Science News, brief reports on what's going on in science. And I've always assumed they're pretty accurate until last month. They did a column on the phonics controversy. They basically parroted Emily Hansford and said, she's shown that phonics is a joke, it's not true, and it's a disservice. I have written my response. It has not yet appeared. And it's soon, if it's not in the next one, it's not going to be, but I will try to publicize it again. Again, intensive phonics is winning, And I think one reason is the attraction of traditional education, the attraction of conscious knowledge, what Alfie Kohn calls the undertow to our traditional instruction. People haven't heard of our way. They haven't heard of subconscious acquisition. When they do hear about it, it is dismissed as magic and osmosis. We have a long way to go, and I'm not giving up. I hope others join me with short papers and letters. What the academics do, as I have harangued you enough on this, I think I'll do more. They write long, complex articles aimed at each other. And they write not to share information. Their articles are written to get published. So reviewers will be impressed. I think reviewers are impressed if the articles are long and not quite comprehensible. They think you must be really smart. Hedges talked about this, great critic. As long as is a good reason why they do this. As long as academics write in the tortured vocabulary of specialization for seminars and conferences, where they are unable to influence public debate, they are free to espouse any bizarre or radical theory. They know no one's going to read or understand their stuff, so they can be the good guy and write about that Frank Smith is right, that Ken Goodman is right, et cetera, et cetera. They could make it so long and complicated, no one has time to read it and no one's going to understand it. So they can feel good about themselves, saying they're on the right side, they're on the side of the angels, but they won't be in trouble for it. Journalists also like to see the world in terms of bad guys and good guys. They don't think loyal opposition the way John Schuman does. They don't think of healthy intellectual debate. So this is the problem. Here's what my suggestion for the future, for those of you who feel like doing this. I do think letters to the editor are a very good idea. I've probably broken the world record for submitted letters to the editor, not for published. I've been averaging 10 to 15 letters a year over the last 40 years, so figure it out. But I don't have the world record for published. The world record for published is a guy in India. I keep track of these things. This is in the Guinness Book of World Records. This guy has published over 3,000 letters to the editor, mostly in local newspapers in India, and he sticks to any topic. He doesn't stick to one topic. He can write a letter on the traffic light at the corner doesn't work, get it fixed, okay? Mine are just about always on this stuff, on language, et cetera, where I have at least a claim to expertise. Why should we do it? A couple of things. First of all, it's a fabulous way of learning to keep things short. I've just spoken for more than an hour, so I really shouldn't say that. If you write a letter to the editor, you have to get your work done and then leave. Make it short. It's good training for elevator conversations where you're trying to, someone says, what is all this stuff? And you can say it in a couple of words. Having to write it and make it short again and again is wonderful training. Here's how, though, to get them published. It can't be just me. I need help. I discovered this when some issue came out in the LA Times. I forgot what it was. I wrote a letter. Jeff McQuillan wrote a letter, and Lucy Say wrote a letter. Without consulting each other, we all more or less said the same thing in different words. Mine got in. I am convinced that mine got in because Lucy and Jeff backed it up. So they got more than one letter saying the same thing. Scholars don't know how important this is. One colleague told me, well, I was going to write a letter, but I saw you wrote one, so I didn't bother. No. When I write a letter and it doesn't get in, which is frequent, and I see the newspaper column and there's a letter to the editor that is similar to mine, I feel good. My hypothesis is I provided an assist, a backup that helped get that other letter published. There are letters now being published in the Santa Monica Daily Press about the cruelty of library cuts. And I wrote the first one, okay? I think others have come in making somewhat different points, but I think they're getting published because there's more than one on the same topic. Slightly different angle, we don't collaborate. This really helps. So my suggestion, react. You know more than the published does about education. You can write 2 lines, even if it doesn't go in. You're making an impact. Keep it short. Your opinion counts. I think most of the audience today is teachers. Let me tell you, the public, when things do get in public domain, they hear from journalists and they hear from researchers like me. Researchers who have never spent a day alone in a room with 10-year-old kids. Who, I could, try to reform. I could go follow a couple of you people around for a couple of years, go to you in your class. I could try teaching 4th grade. I could do that for 5 years. I still wouldn't know what you know. Some of you folks have been out there for 20, 30 years teaching 2nd grade, teaching 4th grade, teaching high school. You have a deep understanding of learning that I will never have. The public needs your point of view. One of my favorite writers, she went under the pseudonym Chem Teacher. I have a collection of everything she wrote. She gave the point of view of a high school science teacher. Gold, absolute gold, things I would never think of because I haven't seen them happen. We need more chem teachers to go out and write and state their opinions. Then we will change public opinion. I need more scholars to help me do this, of course. I would love that. And I need you guys. I need you guys not to write long papers, but to write 3 lines occasionally, supporting what someone else said, saying, here's an anecdote that maintains this. The person who's done a good job of this is Susan Ohanian in her articles. Susan, one of her books is simply a chronicle of her years teaching middle school, what happened with certain students, etc. These need to be in the public domain. So try to help me out. Help us out. Try to help me help you out. It is now, I've been talking for 6 hours nonstop, so it's time for me to stop and see if there are any comments, questions, etc. Je s'en fais.
Yeah, Dr. Krashen, thank you so much for sharing with us tonight. If you would like to answer a question, that we just had some recent questions of how can teachers advocate for story listening in regards. There's not many letters to the editor regarding story listening as far as I'm concerned. I haven't seen anybody publish anything about it, but people are talking about where they could get started. And do you have any advice for people that are new to writing short papers? And
well, you can, a bad place to start, but better than nothing, is to go to my website where I have short articles. We're trying to write short articles. And I have a few letters to the editor posted on the website. I think, thanks to that question, I will do more. But I'll tell you where there's still an issue where story listening comes in. And Dr. Mason's entire approach plays a big role. And that's the role of having a good time in school and listening to stories. Fiction, the power of fiction, a good story. Dr. Mason has said several times, absolutely correct, stories. Stories, you use stories, as she said, have stood the test of time. The kids really get interested in it, and they want to hear, and they want to hear more. Then she moves them into easy reading and eventually into interesting fiction, etc. Mostly fiction is what they really want. Stories is what really counts. So look at the newspapers, see what students are saying about education. Look at the articles on education as they strike you. And I'm not saying go out and do a search, but you read the papers, especially local papers. I read the local papers all the time, and I've published in them. It's great. It's wonderful, because then you can, if your friends see it and say, oh, I saw your letter. You're shopping in the grocery store. Good job, dude. Anyway, so you get instant dramatic feedback. Take a look at what's going on there. When you come across a comment in an article, everybody thinks they know about education, so they're all over the place. State your opinion. Send it in. Share it with us. Very important. That's what Facebook is for. Here's a letter I just submitted to the New York Report, blah, blah, blah. And then we can look at it. We can share it with others. We can affect thousands of people just by what we do on Twitter and Facebook. And the word gets around even if it's not published. So don't sit down and start writing today, but start paying attention to when education comes up in the media, and it does. A lot of the times, unfortunately, it comes up on the spoken media where you see a newscast where they love to diss education. And I don't get much reaction when I send something in. But the print media, you have a chance. So just start paying attention. You'll know what to say.
Great. I think that leaves us with an excellent advocacy assignment. And I think that we can open up the floor of our Facebook group for people to submit things that they're putting out there. Our Facebook page is limited mostly to story listening and guided self-selected reading. But of course, if you go out there and find things that you want to comment on and write responses to the editor about, please submit it to us. Give us other educators a little bit of hope on. It's not that difficult to do. So tonight, thank you so much for Dr. Mason giving us a summary of what we've learned so far in these last 4 seminars, and for Dr. Krashen for taking the time to really inspire the rest of us to get out there and contribute. And so as we conclude this session, we wanted to provide you guys with the opportunity to where you can find the articles mentioned, where you can have active discussions with the people that have presented in the previous seminars. And a great place to get started is to go to our Facebook page. We have a Facebook page for the Stories First Foundation, as well as a Stories Listening and Guided Self-Selected Reading Facebook page. This is a great place where you can ask questions and you can get direct answers from everybody that's been on our seminars for the last 4, and including tonight. And we will be updating our YouTube page continuously. We hope to keep this conversation going, keep everybody that's been interested updated and informed. So please subscribe to any outlet that you can find, the Facebook page, the YouTube page, any of the websites or presenters' YouTube pages or emails that are listed, and reach out to us and ask any questions that weren't answered or that things that you would like to know more about. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'd like to thank all of our presenters that have taken the time every week to rehearse, to come together, to discuss. I think this is a great platform, and especially in this troubled year of the coronavirus, what a benefit for educators to have this opportunity for professional development. So thank you so much. And if anybody else from the Story First team wants to chip in, if I've missed anything, I know a lot of us are in the talk tonight, so you're more than welcome to take the floor. But I think that's a great ending point for us. So thank you, Dr. Krashen.
Well, you missed something, Ben, and I got to correct it, all right? I hate to embarrass you in public. You missed saying thank you to Ben and to Catherine for doing such a great job. Ben, you've been a fabulous host. Very good. You got a new career, dude.
That's going to be recorded for
okay
for posterity forever. So, and obviously in the background we have, Jim is here tonight. We have Claire. We have Katrin. These are people that have been instrumental in making this happen. So thank you.
Beniko had a little to do with all this too.
Beniko had a little to do with all this too. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and please keep in touch with us, reach out, and let's continue this conversation. So good night, good morning, good afternoon.